My name is Sari van Poelje. I'm the CEO of Intact Academy. We give training programs all over the world for coaches and consultants. We teach them from beginner's coach to team coach to organizational consultants to supervisor in many different countries and languages. And the other thing is I'm the CEO of Team Agility, and in that we do agile business innovation design. So we help businesses innovate their business more quickly than they innovate their products, because they'll always be too late in terms of time to market. One of the tools we use to help people change is called Transactional Analysis, or TA for short. And we've been talking about, ego states, the building blocks of personality, transactions, how do people communicate effectively? And now we're talking about how do people stay in their old stories without solving their problems? One way is to racketeer. One way is discounting. And now we're talking about psychological games. We talked about games as an unconscious, non-problem solving pattern of behavior that leads you to a known payoff. There are degrees of games and ways that people get into games. But I want to talk about one of the ways that Eric Byrne, the founder of TA, described games. And he talks about games as Formula G, or formula games. And what he said is every conflict or every game follows the same pattern, which is lucky for us because it makes it much easier to recognize when you're into a game. So I'll add a little bit to what he called Formula G, but this is the way I think anyone gets into a game or a conflict, if you want. So there's a moment of stress. I want to start there. There's a moment of stress. In a moment of stress, your brain already shrinks, as it were. The field of options becomes much smaller. You go into survival mode, and when you're into survival mode under stress, you automatically go to patterns you learned much earlier, and old patterns, that were for our survival as a race, really. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Once you're under stress, what you see people do as the first stage in starting up a game, we call that an exchange of complementary transactions with an ulterior meaning. So on the surface, they look complementary. So I go, "Where did you leave my socks this time, darling?" And everyone on the surface, this seems like a very innocent request, "Where did you put my socks?" But anyone who listens carefully, and it's in the nonverbal, of course, knows that if someone says to you, "Where did you put my socks this time, darling?" that it means quite something else. It might mean, "Keep your hands off my stuff," or "Why do you always move my socks?" or "Darling," in word, but not in actuality. So I don't really think you're a darling now. And we call that a transaction with an ulterior. So there's a social message, which you could take at face value, but there's an underlying, often nonverbal message, which we call an ulterior. So there's stress, and then there's an exchange of ulterior transactions. These ulteriors escalate often. If people are very, very set on having a game, they will escalate their ulterior. And here I'm going to mix things up a bit with a model that we call the drama triangle. I think there's actually three types of ulterior possible. And we each have a favorite, plan A and a plan B. So the ulteriors that people start games with, we could call them persecutor, victim, or rescuer. So you can imagine that an ulterior to start a game is like a fishing rod. And at the end of the fishing rod, there's really, really good chocolate. So there are people who are stressed. They want to get rid of their stress. They walk around with their fishing pole and they're fishing until someone takes the bait. Now, games, conflicts, feel really personal, but in actual fact, anyone could take the bait. It doesn't really matter as long as someone is willing to play the game with you. So we'll come back to that later. But so you're walking around, this is still the ulterior transactions, with your bit of chocolate, and you go, who wants my chocolate? Good chocolate here. And there are three types of chocolate. So one chocolate is, we call it persecutor. So there are people who are stressed, and when they're stressed, they go around saying things, and underneath, they're blaming other people. They're criticizing other people. It ties in with the four horsemen as well, this contempt and this continuous criticism. We call that persecution. So persecution is when you point out what's wrong without there being a need to or a contract for it. So listen, if you hand me in a report and you go to me, you say, I'd like you to point out what I missed. Then if I give you the report back with all these comments in the margins saying what you've missed, because that was our agreement, I'm keeping a contract. It's not persecution. But if you hand me in a report and you say, this is the final version for the board, use it, and I send it back to you underlined in red with all your spelling and grammatical mistakes, without there being a contract for it, so a request from your side, or a need for it, we call that persecution. Yeah? So sometimes, of course, you point out something, you give a directive, and it's not persecution. Like the Titanic is sinking, and I go to the lifeboats. It's not persecution. There's a need for it that I do that. At least I hope people recognize the need for it. And it's a clear directive, it's not persecutionary. But if every time in life, symbolically, I tell you, go to the light, do it now, without there being a clear need or a contract for it, then we call that persecution. So anyway, one way to start a game is you walk around with your little fishing pole and your delicious piece of chocolate, and on the chocolate it says persecution. And to relieve my stress, I go around finding people who I can tell off. That's a great way to start a game. The other way to start a game is you walk around with your fishing pole and you go around rescuing people. So a rescue is when you give help when there's no need or no contract for it. So, and those are the people who go around saying, I only tried to help. Anyway, so if as a leader, I go around and I tell you, I lean over your desk and I say, oh, couldn't you have done it this way? When you haven't asked me any question and there's no need for it, then we call that rescuing. So rescuing, I always think, is the more public relations okay way of persecuting, really. It's more, people accept it more for some reason or another, but both persecution and rescuing are ways of keeping the other person down because you're actually discounting their own capabilities. Yeah, so we go back to discount. The third way to start a game is by playing the victim. Now, a victim is someone who points out vulnerability without there being a need or a contract for it. So they're very, very good at asking for help. That's the positive side. But the problem is a victim is someone who invites, both consciously and unconsciously, help without there being a need or a reason for it. Now, listen, when I had a flat tire and it was raining outside, I shouldn't be telling anybody this, but my neighbor came out and I said, I don't know how to change a tire. Can you help me? And he did it for me. Now, I played the victim and it was quite conscious. I do know how to change a tire, but he was much quicker than I was, so it was all right. He felt good about it. I gave him, a bottle of wine afterwards. He loved the wine, changed my tire. we're now in conversation. That's okay. But it was a little bit playing the victim because I discounted my own competencies to do that. But there are people who go through life discounting their own abilities all the time. And they invite persecution and rescuing as well. And they go around life with their little fishing pole going, I don't know what to do anymore. I don't know. Or it's very warm in here. And someone gets up and opens the window, but they haven't asked any questions. You know, they didn't say, could you open the window for me? They just went, it's very hot in here. So anyway, in this Formula G, this Formula Games, you're in stress and you start a game through an ulterior transaction. You say something on the surface, but underneath you're doing something else, probably from a persecution, rescuer, or victim role. This escalates. And at a certain moment, someone takes this bait, you know, and it escalates. You find people who are complementary to whatever you're doing. And then what happens, according to Formula G, is that there is, he says, a cross-up. He acknowledged that. He puts an X in the formula. And he says, it's a moment where we say in Dutch, the monkey comes out of the sleeve. So really the ulterior comes up to the surface. Like in a conversation about this trash that should go out and someone goes, if you really loved me, you'd put out the trash. You know, it's a victim bid, and but the monkey comes out of the sleeve. At that moment in any conflict or game, there's a silence. It's like being at the center of the storm. And we'll come back to that when we talk about options. At that moment, people have the choice. They can either leave the game, but we'll talk about that in options, or they continue the game. If they then keep on biting that bait, they usually go to the payoff. And in the Formula G, and in the payoff, you end up with your favorite rotten feeling or your racket, and you confirm your beliefs about yourself, others, and life. So, all of us play games. The way that games happen is you start in stress, you go through the 4 steps of Formula G. Ulteriors, cross up, moment of silence, and then payoff. Once you're in the payoff, you also have options, but we'll talk about that later. What I want you to know is, and recognize, is when do you play games? You know, what kind of stress gets you in that? What is your favorite chocolate at the end of your fishing rod? And where do you end up? Because sometimes people start with the fishing rod with great chocolate, they end up in a different role. Yeah. So notice that in the coming week, and we'll speak later.